Dawn over the Pacific was supposed to be quiet. Yet on one April morning in 1945, radio operators across Japan caught the same impossible signal, an aircraft formation approaching from a direction no chart, no doctrine, and no commander had ever prepared them for. Pilots scrambled unsure of what they were climbing to meet. What they found in the sky rewrote everything they thought they knew about war and distance. For most of the war, the skies above Japan followed a familiar rhythm. Enemy bombers came from distant island chains, heavy and slow, their paths predictable. Fighters, when fuel and pilots allowed, rose to meet them, often too late, often too few. In those years, distance itself felt like a defensive weapon, a silent moat stretching hundreds of miles across the Pacific. Every Japanese pilot understood this truth as deeply as he understood his own aircraft. Whatever else happened in the war, geography could not be changed. But by early 1945, something had begun to shift beneath that assumption. Japan's airfields were still scattered across the homeland, the same runways carved into valleys, coastlines, and farmlands. The aircraft were there, some new, some aging, some barely holding together under shortages and rushed repairs. The pilots were there too, young men trained in hurried programs, told they would be the shield against the incoming firestorms of B-29 raids. And yet, beneath the surface of routine, cracks had begun to spread in the nation's understanding of its own security. Reports from the southern approaches occasionally mentioned strange sightings along the horizon, specks too small to be bombers, too distant to be circled by carrier fleets. Some officers dismissed them as reflections, others as mechanical errors. A few veterans, recalling how the war had unfolded elsewhere, felt a tightening in their chest. They had seen this pattern before, the moment when the expected shape of war begins to bend into something new. Half a world away, in factories that never felt the rumble of enemy bombs, American assembly lines were reaching their full stride. Engines thundered through test cells day and night. Crates of parts moved from railheads to ships with clockwork precision. Designs refined over years of combat in Europe were now being adapted, stretched, and reimagined for the vast reaches of the Pacific. In the offices of planners and engineers, someone had begun asking a question that Japanese strategists had never seriously considered. Could a single-engine fighter, properly tuned and supported, cross an ocean guard, a bomber force, still return home? By the time the question had an answer, Japan was already living inside its consequences. The rhythms of the sky were about to change, not through overwhelming numbers or secret weapons, but through the quiet, relentless application of mathematics, fuel, and engineering. The shield of distance, long trusted and never questioned, was about to fail in a way no pilot, no commander, and no doctrine had imagined. For generations, the seas that surrounded Japan were more than borders. They were a barrier that shaped the nation's understanding of war itself. Long before aircraft and radar, long before engines climbed above the clouds, every Japanese strategist had inherited the same lesson from history. Invasions came from the sea, and the sea was vast. Even in the age of flight, the idea remained persuasive. A bomber might cross an ocean with enough fuel and faith in its engines, but a single-engine fighter, never. The mathematics felt absolute. In early 1945, this belief still influenced how Japan positioned its remaining air defenses. Airfields were placed to counter bombers coming from the Marianas. Fighter squadrons were trained to climb steeply toward B-29 seconds and attack with short bursts before peeling away. Any talk of smaller, faster aircraft reaching the home islands from distant American positions was considered misunderstanding or speculation. When intelligence officers discussed the subject, they did so half-heartedly, as if humoring an inexperienced colleague. But the war they believed they understood was already changing. Across the Pacific, a different kind of calculation had been taking shape, one born not from tradition or geography, but from engineering tables, wind tunnel diagrams, and the relentless logic of industrialized war. American planners studying the Pacific theater knew that victory by bombing alone would be costly and slow. B-29 formations flying unescorted faced not just enemy fighters but weather mechanical failures and the sheer distance of every sortie. The capture of Iwo Jima offered an answer, but only if its runways could support something the Japanese believed impossible, a fighter with enough range to accompany bombers all the way to Tokyo and back. At first, even within American circles, the idea felt ambitious. Fighters were by definition short-range instruments, agile, deadly, and fuel-hungry. No aircraft designed to tangle with interceptors at high altitude had ever been expected to fly thousands of miles across open water. But engineering is the art of turning the unlikely into the reliable. In the hands of American designers, the question was not whether a fighter could do it, but what shape that fighter would need to take. The search for that shape had begun years earlier, far from the Pacific. Europe had been the crucible in which the P-51 Mustang first proved itself. Born from a partnership between British engine expertise and American aerodynamic design, the Mustang had grown into a machine unlike any other of its time, sleek, efficient, and astonishingly capable at altitude. The Rolls-Royce designed Merlin engine, built under license by Packard in the United States, transformed the aircraft from a promising design into a world-class escort fighter. By late 1944, Mustangs were shepherding bomber streams deep into Germany, flying farther and faster than any Allied fighter before them. They were not simply protecting the bombers. They were dismantling the Luftwaffe's remaining defenses, sweeping ahead of the bombers, scattering enemy formations, and returning with fuel still in their tanks. War correspondents wrote admiringly that the Mustang had redrawn the map of Europe's skies. Yet those achievements were only the beginning. What set the Mustang apart from other aircraft of its generation was not just its combat record, but the quiet, careful engineering that lay beneath its aluminum skin. Its laminar flow wing, a radical innovation at the time, reduced drag far more effectively than traditional airfoils. Its structure balanced strength and lightness in ways that made long missions feasible, and its Merlin engine, with a two-stage, two-speed supercharger, allowed the aircraft to hold power at altitudes where many opponents began to gasp for air. Engineers and mathematicians studied these traits and noticed something intriguing. Every advantage that made the Mustang deadly over Europe also made it extraordinarily efficient. If fitted with additional fuel tanks, drop tanks that could be discarded before combat, the aircraft's range expanded dramatically. Paper studies turned into test flights. Test flights turned into operational doctrines. By the time Iwo Jima fell into American hands, the Mustang was no longer just a fighter. It was a candidate for something entirely new. Even so, transforming a European escort fighter into a transoceanic guardian required more than optimism. The Pacific was not Europe. The distances were longer, the weather more unpredictable, and the consequences of failure more immediate. A pilot forced to ditch in the North Sea might survive long enough for rescue. A pilot forced to ditch halfway between Iwo Jima and Tokyo was at the mercy of waves, currents, and chance. American planners approached the problem with an engineer's cold patience. They examined wind patterns, fuel burn, statistics, climb rates at various weights, and the effect of tropical humidity on engine cooling. They calculated how much fuel a Mustang would need, not just to reach the Japanese mainland, but to arrive with enough reserve for combat and the return journey. They studied the psychological strain of long missions in cramped cockpits and developed training regimes to prepare pilots for hours of monotony punctuated by seconds of violence. Meanwhile, on the Japanese side of the Pacific, the picture had begun to blur. The empire's industrial infrastructure, once the pride of its military leadership, was buckling under relentless bombardment. Factories responsible for aircraft engines, propellers, and airframes were rearranged, dispersed, or buried underground in desperate attempts to avoid destruction. Production quotas slipped, quality control wavered. Mechanics in frontline units often discovered that new aircraft arrived with tolerances so poor they required days of reworking before they could be flown safely. Fuel shortages were even worse. High-octane aviation, gasoline critical for the performance of late-war fighters, had grown scarce. Crude substitutes, damaged engines, or reduced power output to levels that transformed once formidable aircraft into sluggish, temperamental machines. Pilots took off without knowing whether their engine would hold together under combat power. Many trained students never progressed beyond basic flight skills. Since live-fire training consumed ammunition, the military could no longer spare. Despite these problems, Japanese commanders still trusted in the vastness of the ocean. They believed that even if American fighters possessed advanced engines and clever wing designs, they would remain prisoners of their fuel tanks. To reach Tokyo, a single-engine fighter would have to cross hundreds of miles of ocean fight, then cross the ocean again. No matter how skilled the pilot, or how powerful the engine that demand seemed impossible, it was a comforting belief, and comfort was in short supply. As winter turned to spring in 1945, radar stations along Japan's coastline reported the usual patterns of incoming bombers. Intercepts were launched when possible. Pilots scrambled in machines that sometimes sputtered as they climbed. While the nation braced for mounting air raids, no one imagined that a new kind of threat was about to appear, small, fast, and unannounced. Meanwhile, on Iwo Jima, American ground crews worked in clouds of volcanic dust to prepare Mustangs for missions that had never been attempted before. Mechanics changed engines under open skies. Armorers loaded belts of .50 caliber rounds into wing bays, their movements practiced and efficient. Pilots briefed for missions lasting 8 hours or more, memorizing headings and fuel checks, with the discipline of men who knew that a single mistaken calculation could cost them their lives. Far above them, the Pacific winds swept across the black sands, and somewhere beyond the horizon, the Japanese mainland lay unaware that its last dependable shield, the belief that distance itself offered protection, was dissolving. As American planners finalized routes and checkpoints, a quiet realization spread through the upper ranks. If the Mustang could reach Tokyo, the psychological shock would be as powerful as the tactical advantage. For the first time in the war, Japanese fighters would meet enemies in places they had thought unreachable. Interceptors would scramble not just against bombers, but against the swift, predatory shapes of escort fighters. The balance of the air war would shift not by inches, but by entire doctrines. When the first wave of very long-range missions was approved, the news rippled through American fighter units with a mixture of excitement and apprehension. It was one thing to escort bombers over Europe. It was another to launch from a small volcanic island, fly over nothing but water for hours, engage enemy fighters, then navigate back through unpredictable weather patterns. Veterans understood the stakes. New pilots learned them quickly. The ocean could be merciless, and the margin for error was slim. Yet despite the risks, a sense of inevitability hung in the air. The Mustang had been built for range, refined for stability, and proven in battle. As one American commander remarked in a briefing, "The question is no longer whether our fighters can reach Tokyo. The question is how Tokyo will react when they do." Across the sea, in ready rooms and barracks on Japanese airfields, young pilots tightened straps on their flight gear, checked their sidearms, and whispered the same encouragements that generations before them had spoken. They had no idea that the nature of the sky itself was about to change. For them, the war still made sense. The ocean was wide, the ocean was wide, the enemy was far, and no engine in the world could conquer distance so completely until one morning when the sky proved otherwise. Dawn on 7 April 1945 did not begin with alarms or explosions. It began quietly. A soft, cold light crept over Japan's eastern coastline, illuminating fishing boats, railway bridges, and the rows of neatly planted fields awaiting spring. In the distance, Tokyo Bay mirrored the sky, still and pale. From the ground, nothing suggested that history was about to tilt on its axis. But high above that calm surface, the air was already trembling with propellers. American Mustangs approached their point of no return, an invisible line over the Pacific, after which the only path was forward. Pilots checked their gauges again and again, confirming mixtures, temperatures, and fuel levels. Engines hummed at cruise power, the steady vibration of a machine designed to run for hours, despite the confinement of its narrow cowling. Across the formation, pilots exchanged brief glances. Even through oxygen masks, they could see the same mixture of anticipation and unease reflected in each other's eyes. Many had flown long missions before, but none had flown one like this. Behind them stretched hundreds of miles of ocean. Ahead waited the largest city in Asia, defended by fighter squadrons, whose determination had already cost many Americans their lives. The men tightened their grip on their controls, not because turbulence shook the air, but because the enormity of what they were doing was beginning to settle in. Land-based fighters were not supposed to be here. Not at this altitude, not at this range, not this deep into enemy territory. They were beginning something entirely new. Far ahead, the Japanese mainland was still hidden behind a faint line of haze, too distant to see, yet close enough that every pilot knew the moment of contact was approaching. On the ground, the first hint of danger appeared on a radar screen in a coastal station south of Tokyo. A young operator leaned forward, squinting at the return. The numbers troubled him. The altitude looked right for bombers, but the spacing was strange. He reported the reading to his supervisor, who frowned and tapped the edge of the screen with 2 fingers, as if coaxing the machine into a more sensible answer. Another radar station made the same report. Then a third. The supervisor stiffened. He relayed the data to headquarters, but even as he did, he hesitated. Something about the formation's signature felt wrong, not impossible, but deeply irregular. Yet the duty of a sentry is not to explain, only to warn. Messages rippled across airfields from Chiba to Kanagawa. Pilots sprinted from barracks to hangars, fastening their flight gear as they ran. Mechanics pulled chocks from beneath wheels, shouted last-minute adjustments over the roar of engines, and slapped the skins of departing fighters as if sending off sons to school. Many of those pilots believed they were rushing to intercept bombers. That expectation carried its own dread, but it was a familiar dread. They had fought B 29 seconds before. They knew the drill, climb, attack, dive away, conserve fuel. But the sky they were launching into was different now, though none of them yet understood how. From the cockpits of the first Japanese aircraft lifting off, a thin line of clouds stretched over the bay. Climbing through it, pilots felt the sudden cold at altitude sting their cheeks and fog the edges of their goggles. Engines strained under the increasing load as they vaulted toward the bombers they expected to meet. Somewhere above them, the Mustangs had already dropped their auxiliary fuel tanks. Silver teardrops fell silently through the morning light, tumbling end over end until they struck the fields below with dull, metallic thuds. To farmers looking up, the strange falling shapes appeared almost elegant, like tools dropped from the hands of invisible giants. But the pilots climbing toward those shapes did not yet see the truth. At the moment when the first Japanese fighters broke above 20,000 feet, a new set of silhouettes began to form in the distance: slender wings, sharp noses, a brightness to their aluminum skins that no Japanese aircraft possessed. At first, some pilots thought they were tricking themselves. The shapes were too small to be bombers, too swift, too many. Their radios crackled with clipped voices, confusion, disbelief, urgent corrections to what each man thought he was seeing. One pilot, climbing harder than his engine seemed willing to allow, wiped the inside of his canopy with a gloved hand and looked again. The shapes were closing fast, weaving around the bomber formations with movements too fluid to be anything but fighters. His stomach tightened. These were not Navy aircraft from carriers off the coast. They had no folding wings, no blue-grey camouflage patterns. They bore the star and bar insignia of the United States Army Air Forces, land-based fighters. Here, above Tokyo, the realization hit with a force that no bullet could match. For years, instructors had drilled into their heads that geography protected the homeland. Distance ensured that only bombers could reach so far. Even if American fighters existed that could match Japan's newest designs, they would never appear here, thousands of miles from their bases. The pilot did not speak into his microphone at first. His breath caught and he said nothing, but inside his chest something shifted. It was not fear. Japanese pilots were well acquainted with fear. It was rupture, a sudden break between everything he had been taught and what he now saw with his own eyes. He keyed his microphone and spoke. Fighters, not bombers. Many fighters. The response was a burst of static, followed by a second pilot's voice rising near panic. That's impossible. Fighters cannot fly that far. But impossibility was already streaking toward them. The first engagement happened almost before either side had consciously prepared for it. The Mustangs, using their altitude advantage, dove in sharp, decisive arcs. Their guns flashed white as the first bursts of fire tore through the cold air. Tracers etched curved paths across the sky, bright lines fading into the blue. Japanese formations broke instinctively, peeling left and right, scattering in all directions. But their coordination faltered. They had trained to attack large bombers with predictable flight paths. They had not rehearsed battles against escort fighters maneuvering at high altitude, arriving with strong energy and diving with frightening speed. One Mustang arced downward toward a Ki-84 that had just completed a climbing turn. The Japanese pilot rolled inverted, attempting to slip into a defensive angle, but his engine coughed under the strain of full throttle on mediocre fuel. The Mustang flashed past him, guns blazing. A wingtip caught sunlight just before impacts tore across the Japanese fighter's tail. The Ki-84 spiraled away, trailing smoke. Another Japanese pilot saw the Mustang coming for him and pushed his aircraft into a steep dive, hoping to use gravity to escape. His plane shook violently, as it neared its structural limits. Control surfaces stiffened, the frame rattled with a metallic groan. Meanwhile, the Mustang behind him sliced downward gracefully, its laminar flow wings staying steady even as the speed climbed. The Japanese pilot pulled back hard, too hard. His aircraft shuddered, trembled, then buckled as the airflow overloaded the tail. His machine disappeared into the haze in pieces. Elsewhere in the sky, a trio of Japanese fighters attempted to regroup and mount a counterattack. They were brave, disciplined, and desperate. But bravery alone cannot overcome physics. The Mustangs climbed back into position, their Merlins roaring as they zoomed upward in wide, confident arcs. At altitude, the Japanese engines struggled. Some sputtered. Others ran rough on poor quality fuel. And when the American fighters dove again, the gap widened until the three Japanese machines could no longer fight as a unit. The battle spread like a stain across the sky. Dozens of small, frantic engagements scattered over the expanse above Tokyo Bay. For American pilots used to the methodical formations of Europe, the chaos of the Pacific felt almost primal. But the training remained. They made slashing attacks, avoided turning battles, and maintained altitude discipline. Their aircraft responded faithfully, each movement predictable and smooth. On the Japanese side, the emotional toll mounted quickly. Some pilots fought with grim determination, maneuvering until their engines vibrated so violently that their instruments blurred. Others became overwhelmed by the collapse of their expected tactics. Radios carried short, clipped messages that blended urgency with resignation. They are above us. They are faster. They are everywhere. For ground crews, watching from runways below the spectacle seemed unreal. Tracer fire flickered through the upper layers of the sky like distant fireworks. Aircraft fell in slow arcs, leaving trails of smoke that drifted into the wind. The defenders had seen many battles before, but never one where the enemy arrived with such confidence, such reach, such disruptive force. The outcome was not decided by any single moment. It was decided by 100 small ones, every time a Mustang gained the advantage by climbing effortlessly on its two-stage supercharger. Every time a Japanese pilot hesitated because he knew he did not have the fuel for prolonged maneuvering. Every time a Mustang fired a well-aimed burst made accurate by thousands of rounds of training ammunition the Japanese could no longer afford. Within minutes, the rhythm of the engagement shifted. Instead of climbing aggressively to meet the Mustangs, Japanese fighters began trying to disengage, diving away, or seeking cloud cover. Some turned toward home low on fuel, or shaken by the sheer scale of the American presence. But the battle was not merely physical, it was psychological. The shock of seeing land-based American fighters over the homeland reverberated through every squadron, every intercept attempt, every tactical report filed in the hours that followed. It was the moment distance died, the moment when Japanese aviators realized that the war had shifted to a place where their assumptions no longer applied. Above the haze, the Mustangs regrouped. Below them, Tokyo stretched into the morning, unaware that the skies overhead had become the site of a profound turning point. The pilots did not celebrate. They checked their gauges, adjusted their oxygen flows, and scanned for the next threat. They knew they still had to shepherd the bombers home, cross the ocean again, and contend with weather systems that could kill them as surely as any enemy. But for now, in those first hours of sunlight, they had proven something extraordinary, that the Mustang could cross an ocean fight decisively and return. And that proof, more than any single dogfight or statistic, marked the beginning of the end for Japan's control of its own skies. The shock would linger long after the gunfire faded. The consequences had only begun. In the hours after the first Mustang escort mission returned to Iwo Jima, the volcanic island settled briefly into an uneasy quiet. Mechanics rolled tool carts toward the newly landed aircraft, brushing black grit from their uniforms as they worked. Pilots climbed down ladders, stiffly their knees trembling from hours of immobility. Some leaned against their propellers, breathing in the humid air, blinking away the tension that had clung to them since takeoff. There were smiles, but they were thin. Fatigue pressed into their shoulders like a physical weight, and yet beneath that exhaustion ran a current of disbelief at how surreal the morning had felt, how suddenly the battle over Tokyo had unfolded, how easily the Mustang had fulfilled a mission once dismissed as wishful thinking. While ground crews checked bullet holes and replaced oxygen bottles, the pilots replayed the battle in their minds. The confusion of the Japanese fighters, The moment when formations that should have been disciplined suddenly broke apart. The sight of engines coughing black smoke as the thin air robbed them of strength. The spiraling trails of aircraft diving away without direction or hope. It was not triumph they remembered most clearly. It was the strange silence that followed each engagement, the sense of imbalance in the air, as if something fundamental had shifted. Some old rule of war had been erased and replaced with a new one. Across the sea, that shift was already beginning to reshape the Japanese experience of the war. The first reports from pilots who survived the initial engagement made their way to command posts near Tokyo. Officers listened in strained silence as airmen described being outpaced at altitude, outclimbed in the vertical, and jumped by fighters arriving from vectors they had never considered possible. They described the bright silver wings of the American aircraft, so different from the darker tones of Japan's own machines, and the unsettling fluidity of their maneuvers. Some senior commanders refused to believe the full account. They insisted the aircraft must have been carrier-based or operating from some unknown forward base. Land-based fighters could not have crossed that distance. It violated everything they understood about fuel capacity, engine efficiency, and combat doctrine, but the truth refused to bend. In planning rooms across the Japanese mainland, maps were dragged onto tables. Officers recalculated distances, fuel consumption, wind patterns. They sought another explanation, any explanation other than the one their pilots had provided. But every line of arithmetic pointed to the same conclusion: the Americans had found a way to extend their reach so far that the concept of home airspace no longer had meaning. For Japanese pilots who had witnessed the engagement firsthand, the emotional fallout ran deeper than any map could reflect. One pilot, barely 20 years old, returned to his airfield trembling. He had survived by diving into cloud cover and flying on instruments he barely understood. When he climbed down from his aircraft, he told his mechanic in a hollow voice, "I saw something that should not exist." That mechanic, a veteran of earlier campaigns, asked what he meant. The pilot answered, "They came from the ocean side, not from carriers, from nowhere, like ghosts." His words spread quietly among the ground crew. Some treated them as exaggeration. Others, hearing similar accounts from different units, felt a chill run through them. If American fighters could appear above the homeland unannounced, what else might follow? As the days passed, more Mustang missions took to the air. Each one followed roughly the same pattern: long, silent hours over water, a brief, violent confrontation near the Japanese mainland, a return flight made treacherous by weather fatigue and the constant threat of engine trouble, and each one chipped away at the Japanese air defense network, sometimes through combat, more often through fear and the erosion of confidence. Weather became a character in the story as powerful as any enemy. Pilots described walls of cloud rising like mountains. Instruments spun wildly in turbulence. The Pacific could switch from calm to lethal in minutes. Several missions returned with aircraft missing, swallowed by conditions that showed no mercy. Even the most advanced machines of the day could not navigate every storm. The sky itself remained a battlefield, and it did not choose sides. But for every Mustang lost to nature's unpredictability, a dozen Japanese machines fell to circumstances far more human: worn-out engines, unreliable parts, exhausted pilots, or most tragically empty fuel tanks forcing crash landings on already scarred runways. Japan's aviation infrastructure was unraveling from within. In hangars that still stood intact, mechanics struggled to keep aircraft airborne. Replacement parts arrived irregularly. Some shipments consisted of crates filled with mismatched bolts and recycled components pulled from wrecks. Mechanics filed and hammered pieces into place, praying that their improvisations would hold at altitude. Pilots felt the consequences directly. On takeoff, engines stuttered from low-octane fuel. During climbs, temperature gauges spiked unsettlingly. In combat firing, cannons could cause power loss as engines struggled to manage the strain. Pilots trusted their machines not because the machines were sound, but because they had no other choice. Against this backdrop of decay, the arrival of Mustangs took on the weight of an omen. The shock Japanese pilots experienced was not only tactical or technological, it was existential. For years they had been raised on stories of national resilience and military discipline, of sacrifice and spirit, and the strength of inherited tradition. Their commanders had assured them that Japan's geography was its ally, that even in adversity, the homeland's distance from American bases gave defenders time to react. Now they found themselves fighting an enemy who had quietly rewritten the rules. The Mustang was not just a machine, it was a declaration, a demonstration that the Americans had mastered problems Japan had not even begun to address. As more engagements unfolded, the imbalance became undeniable. Mustang pilots trained extensively in gunnery, navigation, and deflection shooting approached combat with practiced ease. Their formations held shape even in turbulent air. They coordinated attacks with hand signals or brief radio calls. Each pilot knew that if his engine failed, or if he fell into the ocean, rescue patrols or submarines would begin searching almost immediately. Japanese pilots flew with none of that reassurance. If forced to bail out over water, they faced almost certain death. If wounded, they relied on aging medical supplies and overworked staff. If their aircraft developed an engine fault mid-mission, they often had to choose between aborting early or risking their lives to continue. The stress showed in every aspect of their flying. Their stamina waned, their confidence faltered, and when confidence weakens, even experienced pilots lose the edge required to survive. The Mustang raids did more than disrupt Japan's defenses. They accelerated a psychological collapse already underway. Civilians began noticing the change first. They watched small American aircraft zoom overhead at low altitude, strafing factories, airstrips, and rail lines with impunity. The sight was jarring. Bombers could be endured, they had become part of daily life. But fighters suggested a new phase of the war, a phase where the enemy could strike in daylight anywhere it pleased. Newspapers, heavily censored, avoided mentioning these intrusions, but rumors traveled quickly. Railway workers reported being attacked by fast, low-flying aircraft. Fishermen described seeing American fighters skimming the coastline. Teachers heard their students whisper that even the sky above the Emperor's palace was no longer safe. The idea that Japan could no longer defend its own airspace settled like a shadow across the population. Inside military offices, the response was grim. Fuel reserves dwindled. Entire training programs were suspended. Aircraft were grounded to preserve what little gasoline remained. Some units resorted to towing fighters to the end of runways to save the fuel required for taxiing. Commanders issued order after order, urging pilots to conserve ammunition to avoid unnecessary dogfights to prioritize survival over victory. But survival, too, became a luxury. The influx of American fighters altered the B-29 campaigns dramatically. Mustangs escorted bombers on deep strikes, drove away interceptors, and strafed airfields after the bombers turned homeward. By mid-1945, Japan's industrial base was crumbling under both high-altitude incendiary raids and low-level fighter attacks. Factories that had once produced engines or aircraft wings now lay in ruins. Others operated only intermittently, their workforces scattered by raids or shortages. Each week, the gap widened. Each mission, the skies above Japan, shifted further from contested territory toward an American domain. Yet even as Japan's situation deteriorated, moments of small human clarity stood out amid the chaos. On one afternoon near Nagoya, a Japanese pilot barely out of training scrambled into his aircraft after a sudden alert. As he climbed toward the incoming threat, he glimpsed his reflection in the canopy glass, a faint, ghost-like image of a young man who had once dreamed of mastering flight. Clouds brushed past him like smoke. His engine sputtered briefly, then steadied. Far ahead, the bright glint of a Mustang caught the sun. He had been taught to meet the enemy with courage to protect his homeland at any cost. But as he watched the silver fighter close the distance with effortless speed, a single thought emerged. Not of glory, not of loyalty, but of inevitability. The war was moving beyond his reach, beyond the reach of every pilot who had climbed into these skies with hope or desperation. He did not turn away. He kept climbing. But inside he felt the quiet certainty that history had already moved past him. Across the Pacific, in briefing rooms and operations huts, American pilots prepared for more missions. Their faces were lined with exhaustion. Their hands shook slightly as they traced flight paths on maps. Yet they continued, driven by duty, momentum, and the knowledge that each sortie pushed the war closer to its end. The ocean remained vast, and the storms remained merciless. But the Mustang had proven that distance once a fortress had become a doorway the Americans now walked through freely. For Japan, that doorway opened onto a sky that no longer offered protection, only reflection. the reflection of a world transformed by industry innovation and the relentless advance of a war it could no longer shape. A sky in which courage alone was no longer enough. A sky in which the end was beginning. When the war finally ended, the silence that settled over Japan felt unfamiliar. For years, the nation had lived beneath the thunder of engines, the howl of interceptors, and the relentless rhythm of air raid alarms. Now the skies were empty. What lingered was not peace in the usual sense, but a hollow stillness the moment after a storm, when everyone waits to understand what has changed. In the months that followed, the wreckage of fighters lay scattered across rice fields, riverbeds, and factory lots. Some were hauled away for scrap, others were left untouched, slowly succumbing to rust and rain. Among them were the remnants of machines that once represented Japan's pride, the sleek Ki 61 seconds, the agile Zeros, the promising Ki 84 seconds. They stood not as symbols of failure but as reminders of a war fought with extraordinary bravery under impossible circumstances. Meanwhile, on the other side of the world, Mustangs continued flying well into the post-war years. Their engines were overhauled, their paint refreshed, their wings polished to a gleaming shine. Veterans brought them to airshows, letting new generations hear the deep, unmistakable growl of a Merlin accelerating down a runway. In time, these aircraft became icons not merely of victory but of the industrial force that had reshaped aviation and warfare. In Japan, only a single Ki 84 survived the turmoil that destroyed thousands of its sisters. Today it hangs quietly in a museum, suspended in mid-air, as if still chasing an enemy it never had the chance to fully confront. Visitors walk beneath it, unaware that its existence is a mathematical miracle, one aircraft saved by circumstance, while an entire generation vanished in smoke. What makes the story of the Mustang over Tokyo so enduring is not the kill ratios or the engineering breakthroughs. It is the way it revealed a deeper truth about the war, that courage, tradition, and determination, though noble, cannot stand alone against the overwhelming leverage of industry and adaptation. The pilots who scrambled that April morning did everything their training and instincts demanded. They climbed, fought, and risked death with unwavering resolve. But resolve could not refill fuel tanks, rebuild factories, or manufacture engines with the precision the new war required. Distance once protected Japan, but in 1945 distance belonged not to geography, but to those who could erase it, and the Mustang erased it completely. When Japanese pilots first saw those silver shapes cutting across the morning sky, they were not witnessing a single mission. They were witnessing the arrival of a new era, a world in which technology could outrun tradition, and where the map of war was rewritten not by borders but by the reach of a machine. Long after the smoke cleared, the echoes of that transformation remained. The sky had changed, and with it, everything beneath it.